What would you do if you inherited a house and found 30 letters buried under the floorboards, letters never meant for your eyes, written in the middle of a war, soaked in love, loss, and secrets no one ever spoke aloud? Welcome to our YouTube channel. Before we begin, please hit the like button and subscribe so we can continue making stories like this. The sea fog lay thick over the village of Windermere when Elara stepped into the old cottage for the first time, the key still cold in her hand and the air musty with decades of silence. She had inherited the house from a grandmother she barely knew, and though she had expected nothing more than sagging beams and peeling wallpaper, she felt the gravity of something unsaid the moment she crossed the threshold. The cottage was weather-worn, its bones creaking under the weight of time, but the strangest thing was the way the hallway smelled faintly of lavender and ink, as though someone had been writing letters there just yesterday. It was on the third morning, after ripping up floorboards to inspect a sagging joist in the study, that her crowbar caught on something soft, paper, bundled in twine, stained with salt and dust. There were at least 30 of them, some yellowed and others brittle, their edges torn like whispers left too long in the wind, and every envelope bore the same delicate cursive, "To my dearest M." No sender, no return address, only dates, each one marking a year between 1942 and 1946. Elara sat cross-legged on the floor, hands trembling, heart quickening in a way that was both inexplicably tender and electric, as if she had unearthed someone's love and grief in the same breath. She opened the first letter and began to read, and in those pages, the world around her slipped away, replaced by the voice of a man writing from the edge of war, from the edge of loss, to someone he loved more than life itself. His words were raw and aching, full of vivid memories and longing, with phrases like, "I still see you in the reflection of the sea when the sun sets, and I wonder if you're watching the same one from your window." The man, whose name was never signed, spoke of a cottage by the cliffs, of promises made under starlight, and of a war tearing them apart, page by page. Each letter was a breadcrumb through a forgotten life, a deep sorrow wrapped in poetry, and Elara couldn't stop reading, not even when the sun dipped below the ocean or the wind began to howl through the chimney. She laid the letters out on the study table in chronological order, carefully pressing the creases flat, feeling like a trespasser in someone else's love story, but unable to look away. The mystery took root in her like ivy around the bones of the house. Who was M? Who wrote these? Why had they never been sent, or were they? And why had someone hidden them beneath the floorboards, tucked away like precious contraband? The idea that this man may have never seen his beloved again filled her chest with a strange ache, as if she were mourning someone she had never met. That night, she dreamed of a man in uniform, silhouetted in smoke, his voice a whisper. "Find her for me." When she woke, the dream clung to her like sea mist, and she knew with unsettling clarity that the story wasn't finished. It was waiting for someone to listen. So she bought a corkboard, printed out local war archives, and pinned the letters up one by one like clues in a detective's mind. She scanned each one, highlighting names of places, street names, fleeting descriptions of a woman with a rose gold brooch and a laugh that could stop time, and in doing so, began to piece together the image of two lovers trapped in a past the world had buried. But it wasn't only curiosity that drove her. It was something else. Elara had never believed in fairy tales, not since her father left and her mother stopped speaking about love as if it were a good thing. But these letters awakened something tender and sharp, like the sting of salt on an old wound. She found herself lingering by the window at night, wondering if someone had once waited there too, staring out to sea for a boat that never came. The village was quiet, as if holding its breath. The neighbors said little, and the locals who remembered the war were old, their memories fraying like the edges of the paper she held. Still, she walked through the streets of Windermere with the letters in her bag, hoping to spot something, someone, anything, a detail to pull the thread tighter. At the dusty town records office, She found a few enlistment documents with familiar phrasing from the letters, but none signed with a matching name. Yet in the bottom of a filing cabinet, she discovered an old library card with the same cursive handwriting, "To my dearest M," and her heart stuttered in her chest. The card belonged to someone named R. Ainsley, and though no address was listed, the librarian noted the last book borrowed was Wuthering Heights in 1946. Something about that choice made her eyes burn. Who was this man, Elara wondered, who quoted the stars and left love buried under wooden floors for strangers to find? Over the next few days, she barely ate, barely slept, consumed by the mystery of these letters and the lovers within them. But beneath the detective's drive was something quieter, more personal. She realized she envied them, these two ghosts who had once loved so fiercely that their words still hummed in the walls. She had never known that kind of love, had never even dared to want it, not until now. The cottage felt different in the days that followed, warmer somehow, like it remembered. On the seventh night, the wind blew open the study window, scattering the letters like leaves, and among them, one she hadn't seen before. It was dated January 1st, 1947, and it ended with, "They told me you were gone, but I'll keep writing, just in case they're wrong." That's when she knew this was not just a story from the past. It was still alive, and somehow it was calling to her. The name R. Ainsley echoed through Elara's thoughts like a phantom refrain, and it became her compass as she sifted through every scrap of Windermere's history that she could find. Newspapers, funeral notices, forgotten photo albums in the local library's archives, trying to find a face or a trace of the man who once wrote with such impossible tenderness. The villagers were polite but distant, their memories folded neatly like old linen, reluctant to be unfolded, especially for an outsider. Still, the name stirred a faint murmur in a few of the oldest residents, especially when she added, "He might have written love letters during the war." One elderly fisherman, eyes foggy but bright with recognition, murmured that he remembered a quiet boy who used to sit near the cliffs every Sunday, scribbling into a notebook while the sea crashed below, always writing. Said he was writing to someone who never wrote back. The words struck something deep in Elara's chest, and she clung to them, no matter how small, like puzzle pieces that only made sense once you stared long enough. She traced the stories further, following fading footprints through forgotten guest books and hand-labeled boxes of town fair records until she stumbled across a black-and-white photograph, its corners curled like a memory refusing to flatten. It was a group photo from 1945, soldiers home on leave, gathered outside the Windermere Community Hall. One man, standing slightly off to the side, caught her eye, not because of how he looked, but because of how he didn't smile. He held a notebook against his chest, and though his name wasn't labeled, something about the posture matched the voice of the letters, guarded, watchful, quietly yearning. She brought the photo to the same librarian who had helped her find the card, and after a long pause, the woman whispered, "That's Robert Ainsley. He never came back after 47. Disappeared." Disappeared. The word made Elara shiver, not because it was ominous, but because it sounded unfinished. People like Robert didn't just vanish, not when they had a story burning so fiercely it demanded to be found 70 years later. That night, Elara returned to the cottage and sat beside the letters, which now occupied an entire table covered with maps, pins, and scribbled theories. She noticed something she hadn't seen before. In many of the letters, Robert described his walks to a specific cliffside, always mentioning a small bench beneath an ash tree, where he'd sit and send words to the wind. It took her until morning to find the location on a current map. Most of the trees were gone now, but the coastline remained, and the bench, weathered and half sunk into earth, still waited for someone to notice it. She stood there, wind whipping at her coat, imagining the man sitting alone all those decades ago, pouring his love into pages that might never be read. There was a small engraving on the underside of the bench's armrest, so faint she almost missed it. RA+M. The C is the witness. Her heart twisted as she touched the worn initials, the reality of their existence pressing down like mist made solid. But as the mystery deepened, so too did the sense that someone or something was watching her. At night, she began to hear creaks in the cottage that didn't match the old bones of the house, whispers too deliberate to be the wind. Once, she woke to find a single letter moved from the desk to the windowsill, one she hadn't read in days. The cottage, it seemed, was remembering. Or worse, it was grieving. She pushed the fear aside, convincing herself it was just her imagination, heightened by obsession and lack of sleep. Still, she began locking her bedroom door at night and leaving a candle burning beside the letters, as if offering light to the past might bring the truth out of hiding. It was during one of these nights that she visited the local cemetery, following a clue in one of the letters where Robert wrote, "They laid her roses at St. Agnes, but she was never there." The graveyard was dense with silence and the smell of damp earth, and after hours of searching, she found a stone marked Margaret Ellery, 1922 to 1946. No mention of family, no epitaph, only a chipped ceramic brooch of a rose gold flower embedded above her name. Margaret. The M. She had a grave, but no one visited it. Elara stood there for a long time, heart pounding as she imagined Robert's heartbreak, the letters that followed after her death, each one a scream into silence. It explained the desperation in the later pages, the pain twisted into poetic defiance. If death is the end, why does she still answer when I write? That line haunted her, because it suggested something stranger than grief. It suggested Robert may have believed she wasn't gone, or that he refused to believe it. On a whim, she brought one of the letters to Margaret's grave and read it aloud. The wind picked up as if in response, and somewhere nearby, a raven shrieked. Elara almost laughed. Surely she was losing her mind, but as she turned to leave, she spotted a fresh footprint in the mud beside her own. Larger. Deeper. Not hers. She stared at it, throat dry, until the wind erased it like chalk from a blackboard. Whether it was memory, ghost, or coincidence, she couldn't say. But she knew this. Robert's story wasn't over. And someone or something was making sure she understood that. The next day, she found a book on her doorstep. No note, just a weathered volume of Wuthering Heights, the same book Robert had last borrowed in 1946. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a folded piece of stationery. It read, "I was not the only one who loved her." No signature. Elara stood frozen in the doorway, the book heavy in her hands, and realized the mystery had just deepened, and someone else, perhaps someone still alive, had now entered the story. She was no longer just reading the past. She was part of it now. The old bookshop stood at the far edge of Windermere's narrow high street, cloaked in ivy and shadows like something misplaced from time, its windows fogged with age and mystery. Elara had passed it several times without noticing, odd, given her recent obsession with forgotten words, but today, as if summoned, the door creaked open just as she approached, a bell above it chiming a note so fragile it seemed to dissolve midair. Inside, the scent of aged paper and sandalwood clung to the air, and the shelves curved and tilted with the weight of stories too tired to stand straight. A man stood behind the counter, half buried in a stack of hardcovers, his long fingers tracing the spine of a first edition as if reading it through touch alone. He looked up when she entered, and for the briefest moment, his eyes flashed with something, recognition, maybe, or unease, but it vanished as quickly as it came. His name was Jonah Marrow, the shop's reclusive owner, a man whose name had never come up in her searches, but who seemed to know exactly why she had come. When Elara mentioned the letters, his brow furrowed. He asked no questions, only gestured to a table near the back where a kettle steamed beside two chipped cups. There was something careful in the way he moved, like a man with broken things in his past who had learned how not to break anything more. She sat across from him and laid out the letters, not all, just a few, watching his face as he read. At the second letter, his jaw tightened. At the fourth, he looked away. She asked, quietly, if he knew Robert Ainsley. Jonah said nothing for a long time, then finally, not personally, but his words are familiar. He hesitated, then admitted that years ago, a woman, an American historian researching wartime communications, had come through Windermere looking for Robert too. She stayed for a month, then vanished without warning. No forwarding address. Just gone. The mystery bloomed wider, more intricate, the petals of a flower with too many layers to count. Jonah reached beneath the counter and brought out a box wrapped in canvas and twine. Inside were clippings, postcards, and notes, some in Robert's handwriting, others in a different script altogether. He explained that over the years, fragments of the same story had floated through his shop, people leaving behind letters, drawings, marginalia in borrowed books, as if Windermere itself was collecting echoes of a love that refused to die. He had been keeping them safe, uncertain why, only knowing they didn't belong to the silence. Elara felt the weight of those objects like bricks in her chest. One note caught her eye. It was a torn half of a page, marked with the words, "He said she walked out of the sea. That she was dead, and then she wasn't." Her breath caught. The phrase was impossibly eerie and maddeningly vague, but it aligned with the tone of Robert's final letters, the ones that blurred grief with something more surreal, visions, dreams, whispers of the impossible. When Elara asked Jonah what he believed, he gave a sad smile and said, "There are truths too painful to face unless we dress them as ghosts." She didn't know whether he meant Robert's loss or something stranger still. But as the hours passed and they sifted through papers together, she noticed something about Jonah. He wasn't just curious, he was invested. Deeply. When she casually asked if he had ever met Margaret Ellery, his silence told her more than any answer could. After a long pause, he pulled out an old photograph, two young boys and a girl standing on a beach, laughing, her hair tied with a ribbon, sunlight captured on her cheek. "That's her," he said softly. "We were 13. She was everything then." His voice broke slightly, but he caught it, steeled it. Robert loved her. I just watched from the edge. It dawned on Elara then. Jonah had known them. Not as myth, not as history, but as living people. He had kept this to himself all these years, a living museum of sorrow, guarding someone else's story because it was the closest he'd ever come to his own. She asked why he never spoke about it, why he let the town forget. He replied, because no one wanted to remember. The war stole more than lives. It erased the ones who came home with too many ghosts. Jonah confessed that Margaret had changed near the end, that she would stand by the cliffs for hours, humming a song that no one else could hear. That she told him once that Robert still wrote to her, even after he had supposedly left town. The townsfolk assumed she was grieving madly. Some whispered that she had gone touched in the head. Then one day, she disappeared. Her body washed ashore a week later. No one ever found a cause, just that brooch and seafoam in her hair. Jonah looked at Elara with a mix of warning and mourning. There are things in this town that linger. Not all of them kind. But Elara couldn't stop now. Something beyond logic was pulling her deeper. She asked to take the box home to study, and though he hesitated, Jonah finally agreed. On one condition. If you find something you shouldn't, bring it back. Don't burn it. Don't bury it. Some truths rot if you try to hide them again. His words followed her all the way back to the cottage. That night, she pored over the contents, noticing how many artifacts referenced the sea, the cliffs, and a phrase she had begun to see repeated again and again in different handwriting. The tide remembers. It was scrawled in the margins of Robert's drafts, inked on the back of photographs, carved faintly into the inside cover of the Wuthering Heights copy. She didn't sleep. She stayed up mapping timelines, cross-referencing names, and in the process, found one detail that had eluded her before. Robert's final known address was listed as Harthmas Lighthouse, a structure long abandoned, miles from the village, and accessible only by low tide. No one had mentioned it before, but the next morning she would go. Because whatever answers lay waiting in the story, they were not just hidden, they were guarded. And she now suspected she wasn't the only one trying to uncover them. She was simply the first to get this far in years. The path to Harthmas Lighthouse wasn't marked on any current map, and locals gave conflicting directions when asked. Some said the structure had collapsed years ago. Others claimed it never existed. But Jonah's old documents included a hand-drawn chart with tide tables and a narrow stretch of sand that appeared between the cliffs only for a few hours at dawn. Armed with a chart, a flashlight, and a wrapped parcel of letters, Elara began her journey before the sun breached the horizon, her boots crunching against pebbles as the ocean retreated like a breath held too long. The wind was sharper here, laced with salt and something older, something like anticipation. Harthmas stood like a silhouette carved from shadow and stone, half swallowed by ivy, windows broken, its once white walls grayed to the color of secrets. It loomed against the breaking light with the gravity of a place long waiting to be found. Elara felt the shift as she stepped onto its weathered steps, like crossing an unseen threshold, not just in space but in time. Inside, the air was colder than the outside wind, and dust clung to everything like a second skin. The spiral staircase groaned beneath her, but she climbed, following intuition and the faint echo of possibility. At the top, in the keeper's quarters, the room was strangely intact. Books, maps, a rusted lamp, and on the far wall, a desk faced the sea with a chair still tucked in neatly, as if the writer had only stepped away for a moment. On the desk sat a box. Wooden. Locked. But beside it lay a brass key taped to the back of a photograph. Robert, unmistakably him, standing beside a woman whose face had been scratched out with something sharp. The sight chilled her, not because of the violence in the gesture, but because it suggested someone else had been here. And maybe they hadn't left. She turned the key and opened the box, and there they were, letters never meant to be found. These weren't addressed to M. They were addressed from her, dated months after her reported death. Each one was a response to Robert's words, scrawled on faded, mismatched paper in a hand that trembled but burned with emotion. You write like I'm dead. But I'm not. Not entirely. Elara's breath caught as she read the next line. I see you by the sea. I feel your words in my bones. But they won't let me leave the water. The implications were impossible, ungraspable. Was this a metaphor, a delusion, or something else? One letter ended with, they say love the strong can call you back, but only if someone else finds the path. A chill rolled down her spine as the wind howled outside, and for a moment, the lighthouse creaked like it was remembering her. The tide was already returning. She had maybe an hour before she'd be stranded. She gathered the letters and turned to go, but a movement caught her eye. A small door behind the desk, half hidden by shelving. Inside was a crawl space, dark and tight, and though every part of her wanted to ignore it, she forced herself in, crawling until she emerged in a hidden alcove within the tower itself. There, scrawled in charcoal along the stones, were hundreds of versions of the same sentence. She's not gone. She's just somewhere the sea keeps her. Some were old and faded, others newer. And one, written in red chalk, was dated 2 weeks ago. Elara staggered back out into the light, heart pounding. Who had written that? Was someone else trying to find Margaret too? Or worse, had they already succeeded? She ran back down the staircase, and as she reached the entrance, the sea was already licking at the sand. She raced back across the beach, nearly slipping in the tide, the letters pressed against her chest like they might dissolve if she let them breathe. Back at the cottage, soaked and shaking, she spread the letters out on the floor. Her world had tilted. The story was no longer one of love lost. It was one of love suspended, like a breath underwater that hadn't been released in decades. That night, Windermere was hit by a storm. Power lines cracked. The sky split open. And at midnight, someone knocked on her door. Not once. Not frantically. Just 3 steady taps. She froze. Every light in the house flickered, and when she approached the window, no one was there. But lying on the porch was another letter. This one was recent. Fresh ink. Sealed in red wax. It was addressed to Elara. Hands trembling, she broke the seal and read the single sentence inside. You've come far enough to see her. No signature. No return address. She sat down, shaking, unable to breathe. Somehow, the story was now looking back at her. The next morning, Jonah was gone. The bookshop locked, dustier than before, with no sign of him. The townspeople claimed he hadn't lived there in years, that the shop had been boarded up since 2016. Elara stood frozen on the cobblestones, the weight of impossibility pressing down. Had she spoken to a ghost? Or had Jonah been protecting the secret until someone could finish what he couldn't? She ran back to the cottage, only to find her wall of pinned letters rearranged into a spiral. At the center was a photo she had never seen before. Margaret, hair wet, standing barefoot at the edge of the sea. On the back, written in a script she now knew by heart, were the words, "She walked out once before. She might again, but only if love calls her by name." Elara sat beside the window until nightfall, the photo pressed against her chest, and whispered the name again and again, Margaret. 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 Outside, the sea whispered back. In the days following the storm, Windermere seemed to slip into a peculiar hush, like a village holding its breath beneath the weight of something sacred and unresolved. Elara found herself wandering its fog-laced streets with a different rhythm now, not that of a researcher, but of a witness caught in a loop she could no longer rationalize away. The letters, the photo, Jonah's disappearance, and the lighthouse that now no longer appeared on satellite maps. All of it was blurring the line between fact and fable, between grief and presence. And then there was the knock. 3 soft taps. Every night, just past midnight. No matter what she did, lock the doors, leave lights on, even sleep with a cottage key under her pillow, those knocks returned, steady and solemn, as though time itself had learned to call. But the most jarring development wasn't ghostly. It was a man. Elias, newly returned to Windermere, or so he claimed, was a photographer from London who had inherited his uncle's abandoned property at the far end of the cliffs. Elara first met him at the grocer's, where they exchanged polite smiles and awkward greetings, the kind born from recognizing a fellow outsider. But when he asked where she lived and she mentioned the old Ainsley cottage, something flickered across his face, almost like recognition, or maybe wariness, before he masked it with a casual, "Nice view from up there." In most circumstances, she would have thought nothing of it. But nothing in Windermere was just coincidence anymore. Their paths kept crossing. At the bakery, the old church, even near the cliffs where the tide swallowed the path to Hearthmist. Each time, Elias offered warmth without intrusion, a patience that unnerved Elara more than any ghost, because his presence felt familiar. One morning, she spotted him near the bench below the ash tree, camera in hand, aiming it toward the horizon where the sea kissed the sky. She confronted him, unable to shake the paranoia that he was watching her. Elias smiled and said, "I photograph places that remember." When she asked what that meant, he added, "This town doesn't forget. It just waits." Something about his phrasing echoed Robert's words, and that night, she reread the last letters aloud again. They no longer felt like old pages. They felt like echoes of her present, as if the story she'd followed was beginning to superimpose itself on her own. In the margin of one previously overlooked letter, Robert had scribbled, "History bends. It always returns to the shape of love." And now, as Elara stared at her wall of artifacts, a terrible, beautiful thought occurred to her. What if this isn't just about discovering the past? What if she was living its second act? And worse, what if she wasn't the first to try? Driven by a new urgency, Elara began compiling every reported disappearance in Windermere since 1947. There were few, but enough to create a pattern. A young woman in 1969. A sailor's daughter in 1981. The historian Jonah mentioned in the 1990s. Each drawn by letters, or the lighthouse, or a sudden, unexplainable desire to walk the shoreline during high tide. She began to believe the story of Robert and Margaret wasn't a closed chapter, but a cycle. One where the tide called to a witness, to a seeker, every generation, and they either found the truth or were swallowed by it. Elias became a companion in her search, though reluctantly at first. He admitted he had found a letter, too, tucked into a rusted lantern on his property. It was signed M and addressed to no one. A simple phrase, "You must tell the story, even if it ends again." When he showed it to her, Elara felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. They were both being drawn into the same orbit. And then, one evening, something shifted between them. Not just a shared curiosity, but a charge, a magnetic hum like the tide pulling them both into something older than choice. Under the falling dusk, Elias kissed her. Softly, as if unsure whether she would vanish if he touched her too deeply. And for a moment, the world stilled. But the warmth of it was undercut by something colder the next morning. Elara woke to find all her letters gone. Every last one. Her notes, maps, even Jonah's box, all missing. Only one item remained on the table, the photo of Margaret barefoot by the sea. But now, her face was no longer scratched out. Instead, it was Elara's. She stared in horror, her pulse deafening. Either someone was trying to frighten her, or the story was no longer hers to control. She ran to Elias, heart in her throat, but his cottage stood open and empty, camera on the table, lens shattered. On the wall, someone had written in charcoal, "The sea chooses again." She collapsed in the sand by the cliffs, the wind screaming around her like the wail of every vanished soul. The tide was rising. The spiral was closing. But deep in the hollow of her fear, a truth burned. Love this strong did not end. It recycled. It rewrote. It demanded an ending, even if the ending cost everything. That night, the knock came again. This time, she opened the door. No one stood there. Only the wind. And one final letter. Fresh. Addressed not to M or to R, but to E inside. Just 5 words. "Will you finish the story?" Elara stood at the edge of the sea, the final letter trembling in her hand, and for the first time since her descent into Windermere's past began, she felt not just like a witness, but like the hinge between everything that had come before and all that might still come after. The weight of that 5-word message, "Will you finish the story?" settled deep into her bones, as if the sea itself had whispered it. That night, she didn't sleep. She read every remaining note, every trace left behind, and finally understood what none of the records, ghosts, or even Jonah had said outright. That Windermere was not just a village with a haunting, it was the haunting. A place where unresolved love turned time soft, where longing defied linearity, and where the sea kept score of hearts broken too soon. The next day, Elara packed lightly, a thermos, a journal, the last remaining letters from M and R, and a single photo, the one where Margaret's face had become her own. She left the cottage unlocked, not expecting to return, and made her way to the cliffs just before dusk, following the tide's retreat until the path to Hearthmist emerged like a memory stepping out from under years of silence. Each footstep echoed louder than the one before, and when she reached the lighthouse, the door was already open. Inside, the light at the top flickered, though the power had long since been severed, and the stairwell pulsed with the weight of words unsaid. She climbed. Not quickly, not fearfully, but with the calm of someone who had made peace with the possibility that she was no longer merely alive in the ordinary sense of the word. At the top, the room waited exactly as it had weeks ago, but this time, the box on the desk was open, the letters within scattered as if stirred by wind that never touched anything else. A single page sat at the center of the floor, heavy with ink. She walks now again. But for how long? Elara sat down slowly, placing her journal beside the note. For a moment, nothing moved. Then she began to write. Not a letter, not a confession, but a retelling, a complete, uncompromising, brutal and beautiful accounting of the story she had pieced together, including the parts that had lived in shadows. Robert's final days, Margaret's strange return, the lighthouse as a waypoint between loss and longing, and her own spiral through the echoes of their choices. As the words spilled out, the wind died entirely. Even the sea seemed to still. She finished as the moon broke over the water. Her hand trembled, not from fear, but from certainty. She closed the journal, sealed it with the red wax she had carried since receiving the letter, and placed it in the wooden box. Then, in a motion that felt entirely natural, she opened the door and stepped out onto the balcony that overlooked the ocean, just as Margaret had once done. The air was thick with memory, or maybe mist, or maybe both. And then she saw her, standing at the edge of the sand, where the water kissed the earth, barefoot and radiant in the moonlight, was Margaret. Her dress billowed, not from wind, but from something internal, something that shimmered with impossible calm. Her eyes met Elara's, and in them, Elara saw not just the woman from the letters, but every woman who had walked these cliffs, every story unfinished. Margaret raised one hand, not to wave, but to beckon. And behind her stood Elias, not as she had known him in Windmere, but older, timeless, wearing the same expression Robert had worn in the only photo Elara had ever found. And just like that, it made sense. Elias had never been new. He had returned. Like her. They all returned, those who carried the story in their blood, even if they didn't know it. Elara stepped down the stairs and walked back across the sand. The water lapped gently now, warm against her boots, as though welcoming her home. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't have to. She simply turned and began walking toward the sea. Elara followed. 1 step.
2.
The water climbed to her ankles, her knees, her waist, but she wasn't afraid. Beside her, Elias reached out his hand. She took it. The sea swallowed them in silence. And then morning. Windmere woke to soft sun and the faint scent of salt. The tide had receded. The cottage on the hill stood quiet but intact, its window open, a faint breeze turning the pages of a journal left behind. The villagers went about their day, unaware, or unwilling to say, what the sea had taken or given back. But at the bench beneath the ash tree, a boy found a letter tucked beneath the armrest. It was sealed in red wax, addressed simply, to whoever still believes. And so, the story begins again. The boy who found the letter beneath the ash tree bench was named Nathan Holloway, a 17-year-old who had lived in Windmere his entire life, but never felt it belonged to him, until that day, when he opened a wax-sealed envelope and read words written in a hand long vanished. The letter wasn't addressed to him by name, but the tone felt personal, as if someone knew he would be the one to find it. If you still believe, then the story is yours now. But don't read too far unless you're ready to remember. He didn't know what that meant, remember what, but he pocketed the letter and felt something inside him shift, as if a song he'd never heard had started playing faintly behind his ribs. That night, he dreamed of a lighthouse crumbling into the sea and a woman with seaweed in her hair whispering his name. Elara? He had asked, confused, but she just smiled and said, "Not yet." The dreams intensified over the following days. Nathan began hearing snippets of voices when he walked by the cliffs, and sometimes he'd find footprints in the sand when no one else had been out. In school, his friends joked that he'd become the ghost magnet, but their laughter faded when Nathan started asking questions about Harthmas Lighthouse and discovered it didn't appear on any map. He went to the library to verify the site, but the books were strangely unhelpful. Historical texts had been redacted. Photos were blurred. One librarian, an older woman with pale blue eyes, warned him not to look too hard. "Some stories find you," she said, "but if you find them first, they remember you." Then, one afternoon, while cleaning out the attic of his grandmother's house, Nathan stumbled across a journal tied in red ribbon. Inside was the same handwriting as the letter he had found, but this wasn't a letter. It was a complete narrative, nearly 400 pages, telling the story of Robert Ainsley, Margaret Ellery, and a woman named Elara who had come decades later to untangle the mess of love, memory, and something unspeakable beneath the sea. Nathan read the journal in a single breathless night. He felt every line as if it had been carved into his bones, like the story had been waiting inside him for years. But the most unsettling part was the final entry. "If you're reading this, then it didn't end with me. Please don't go to the lighthouse alone." He should have listened. But obsession is a quiet fire. Nathan began reconstructing the story, pinning timelines and sketches on his bedroom wall, red strings mapping heartbreak like constellations. When his mother entered his room one night and saw the chaos, she turned pale and whispered, "You're just like him." When he pressed her, she confessed that her mother, Nathan's grandmother, had once known Elara, that they had spoken often in Elara's final months, that she had disappeared without a trace. And then she said something Nathan would never forget. "The sea doesn't drown everyone it takes. Some it keeps, some it sends back." Changed. The next day, Nathan found his way to the cliffs and waited for the tide to fall. But the path to the lighthouse never appeared. Instead, the fog thickened unnaturally, and a voice, Elara's unmistakably, spoke from the mist. "Not yet." Over the next week, Nathan noticed changes in himself. He began writing letters he didn't remember composing. He knew things about Windermere's geography that he'd never studied. One evening, he sketched a picture of the lighthouse's interior with uncanny accuracy, down to the carvings on the walls. When he flipped to the next page of the journal, the same image was there, dated 40 years earlier. Terrified but unable to stop, Nathan sought out the one place that had answers before, Jonah Marrow's bookshop. It was open, lit, as if waiting. But inside, he found only silence and dust. Until, from the back room, came a voice. "You opened the letter, didn't you?" He turned, and there stood Jonah, older, more hollow than any photograph, but undeniably alive, or something like it. Jonah told him that time wasn't linear in Windermere, that love created anchors, that memories lived not in people, but in places, and that the lighthouse had become a threshold, not between life and death, but between forgetting and remembering. Nathan asked the question he'd been afraid of, "Am I part of the story now?" Jonah's answer was a long silence. Then, "You always were. You just didn't know which chapter." Nathan's dreams shifted. Where before they had been cryptic images and whispers, now they came with clarity, like memories, but not his own. He would wake up with sand in his sheets, or sea salt crusted on his arms. Once, he found a kelp strand wrapped around his ankle, despite never leaving his house the night before. Each morning he awoke more exhausted than the last, and yet more complete. Something inside him was assembling, rebuilding itself out of fragments he couldn't consciously access. The line between remembering and becoming was dissolving, and it terrified him. He told no one. Not his friends. Not his family. Only the journal, Elara's journal, received his confessions, its margins filled now with his writing, bleeding into hers like parallel voices in the same conversation. One afternoon, standing again at the cliff's edge, Nathan found the path to the lighthouse visible for the first time since the fog had closed it off. The tide had pulled back in a way that didn't align with any published charts, exposing sand slick and gray like old bone. Something in his chest clicked. This was the invitation. But it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a test. With the journal under his arm, he followed the path to Hearthmist. The lighthouse no longer looked abandoned. Light pulsed softly from its crown, and through the fog, it seemed almost to breathe. As he stepped through the door, the air shifted around him, heavy and electric. The space had changed. The furniture was different. The walls were free of dust. A kettle steamed quietly on the stove. It was like he had walked into someone's memory, preserved not as a ruin, but as a room awaiting its owner. In the mirror above the fireplace, Nathan saw not himself, but Robert Ainsley. For just a moment, the reflection belonged to another life. When he blinked, it was gone. On the desk sat a new letter, addressed in the same unmistakable hand. To N. He opened it, hands shaking. You are closer than anyone before. But the truth is older than me, or her, or the sea. Windermere was born of forgetting. The lighthouse is its wound. If you wish to know everything, be warned. Some truths dissolve memory. Some truths rewrite the self. Ask only if you're ready to lose who you were. At the bottom, it was signed, Elara. Nathan sat down in the chair by the desk and stared at the letter. Not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. On some level, he had known since the beginning. These weren't just echoes of love or tragedy. They were fragments of a story that had become recursive, feeding on memory, looping through time, fueled by love so strong it refused to be forgotten even by death. And each time someone tried to solve it, they became a part of it. Not by fate, by choice. Or rather, by belief. As he rose, the lighthouse pulsed with light. And then he heard her, not from a letter, not from a dream, but in real time. Nathan. Elara's voice, unmistakable. He turned toward the spiral stairs, heart hammering. She was there, part light, part shadow, part memory. A spectral form, yes, but solid enough to weep. Her eyes held gratitude and sorrow. She told him the truth unfiltered. The sea beneath Windermere had once been the site of a tragedy that fractured time. A shipwreck in the 1800s, carrying lovers from opposing nations, whose union had been cursed by both their families. The ship sank, but not before one lover made a vow. Let us be remembered, even if the world forgets. That vow took root in the land, in the sea, in the people who lived and died there. It birthed a cycle. Every few decades, a pair of souls would unconsciously reenact the same story, a doomed love, a haunting separation, a return to the lighthouse to finish what never ended. Robert and Margaret were one loop. Elara, another. Nathan now the next. The town of Windermere didn't remember because it couldn't. The cycle demanded amnesia, so it could reset. That's why the lighthouse kept returning and disappearing. That's why the villagers had hazy memories and histories with gaps. That's why no one ever left Windermere permanently. They either forgot or were forgotten. Elara explained that she had walked into the sea not to die, but to preserve the memory of the story, to feed it so that it could eventually be broken. You have the chance to end it, Nathan. But it will cost you. He asked. What? She replied. Everything you know of yourself. If he published the journal, if he spoke the story aloud, wrote it down truthfully and shared it, he would free the village, break the cycle. But in doing so, he would be written out. Not erased, but unwritten. He would become the next whisper, the next letter, the next myth. The town would be healed. But he would live on only in margins. Just like Robert. Just like her. Nathan stared at her. Then at the journal. Then back at her. And he said, "Tell me where to start." Nathan stood at the top of Harthmas Lighthouse, the vial of ink-dark seawater in his hand, as the sea pounded the rocks below like a heartbeat that had long since forgotten how to rest. The world outside the tall windows was wrapped in mist and moonlight, but inside the lighthouse, everything had sharpened to a stillness that felt sacred, like a cathedral waiting for its final hymn. Elara watched him from across the room, her form flickering faintly at the edges like a candle's reflection on moving water. Around them, the air was dense with history, letters folded into shadows, names etched into dust, tears dried into the wood. And the sea outside waited, not with violence, but with patience. The kind of patience only an immortal grief could hold. For a long time, Nathan said nothing. He stared at the vial, this small thing that held the weight of every unanswered question, every lost kiss, every soul that had walked into the water and not come back whole. In his pocket was the last letter Elara had written before vanishing. He hadn't shown it to anyone. It had only 2 lines. "If you let it end, we are forgotten. But if you don't, so are you." And now he understood what she meant. To end the story was to erase its power, but also to erase its characters. Margaret, Robert, Elara, Jonah, and now him. Every thread would unravel, and no one would remember the love that defied time. But perhaps that was the cost of healing. Elara stepped closer, her eyes shimmering, not with tears, but with light. "I tried to do what you're about to do," she said, her voice a memory pulled into the present. "But I couldn't. I was too far in. You're still close enough to turn back." Nathan looked at her, and for the first time, she seemed afraid. "Will I lose you?" he asked. She didn't answer, because they both already knew, yes. The moment he drank it, she would vanish. Not because she was a ghost, but because she was a chapter, and the book would be closed. And yet, part of him resisted. Not because he was afraid of forgetting, but because the story deserved an ending. Not silence. Not abandonment. It deserved to be remembered, not just by one person, but by the world. That was the trap. The sea didn't need pain. It needed audience. And Nathan had almost given it exactly that. He dropped the vial. It shattered on the stone floor, spilling its contents like black tears, seeping into the cracks of the lighthouse. The sea outside roared in response, not anger, but grief. Something immense and ancient howled in the wind, and the tower shuddered as if mourning the choice. But Nathan stood firm. He took the journal from his coat, and with Elara still watching, he began to read aloud. Not to her, not to the sea, but to himself. Robert Ainsley wrote his first letter to Margaret in 1942, not knowing it would be the beginning of a wound that would stretch across generations. As he spoke, the lighthouse began to glow, not with the pale blue of haunting, but with golden, warm light. The sea outside calmed. The fog lifted. The structure beneath him felt lighter, as though something uncoiled at its foundations. Elara smiled. She was fading, yes, but not in pain. In peace. "You didn't break the cycle," she whispered. "You rewrote it." Her final words echoed as her form dissolved like ink in water. "Now, let someone remember you." The next morning, the villagers of Windermere awoke to something strange. The lighthouse, which had not appeared in decades, now stood plainly visible at the end of the beach. The path to it was dry, accessible, and a book sat on the bench beneath the ash tree. Its cover read, "Letters Beneath the Floorboards." No author name, no publisher, just page after page of impossible history. Most assumed it was fiction. A few knew better, and one by one, readers began to dream. They dreamed of a woman in a study, reading letters out loud by candlelight. Of a man beneath the sea, still writing. Of a boy on the cliffs, turning memory into light. The sea became quieter after that. The tides more regular. The fog no longer lingered. People stopped disappearing. The bookstore reopened. Tourists came and went. The cycle was still there, but it no longer consumed. It was finally content. As for Nathan, no one remembered him, not truly. His name faded from records. His room at home became a guest room. His friends couldn't quite place when they'd last seen him. But sometimes on windy nights, a figure could be spotted walking the path to the lighthouse, journal in hand. And if you listened closely by the ash tree, the bench would creak slightly, as if someone had just stood up and left you a letter. And every so often, someone new would find the book, read it, and believe. Thank you for diving into our incredible stories. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures. This is just the beginning. There's so much more to come. Until the next story, keep believing.